He lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The streets were lined with old trees and the sidewalks had cracks filled with tiny patches of grass. From the outside, his house looked like any other home. A modest lawn, a small porch with a few chairs and a door that opened to a cozy living room. People who passed by often saw him tending his garden, waving politely, or simply walking to his car to run errands. On the surface, his life seemed ordinary, peaceful and predictable. He had always valued peace. After years of moving from city to city, often for work that required him to be far from home, he had found a place where he could breathe freely. He liked the rhythm of quiet mornings with a cup of coffee on his porch, the soft hum of birds and the occasional laughter of children playing down the street. For him, life was about small joys, watching a neighbor's dog chase a ball, seeing flowers bloom in spring, or hearing the familiar sound of someone greeting him on the street. People rarely knew much about him beyond his friendly smiles and polite hellos. That was exactly how he wanted it. Over the years, he had learned that most people preferred things simple. They didn't need to know the depths of someone else's life, the struggles, the training, the sacrifices, and he had a past that he kept tightly sealed. A part of himself he rarely shared with anyone. Only in the quiet of his own home, in the moments when he was alone, could he let his mind drift back to those years. Those years were not ordinary. They were filled with discipline, danger, and a kind of intensity that few people could imagine. But here, in this peaceful neighborhood, he wore the mask of the ordinary man. He worked a regular job, did his grocery shopping, and greeted the neighbors with warm smiles. He helped carry a bag for an elderly neighbor and occasionally mowed the lawn for someone who couldn't. His life had a rhythm, a calmness that he cherished. Yet even in this calm, he always remained aware. Awareness had been drilled into him over years of training and experience. He noticed the little things: a new car parked suspiciously down the street, someone lingering too long on a corner, the way shadows moved when they weren't supposed to. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it, but he did. He knew that the world had people who could bring danger in subtle ways, and though he tried to leave that life behind, a part of him always stayed ready. Life was comfortable, but not perfect. He noticed that some neighbors treated him differently, though not overtly. There were glances that lasted a second too long, whispers that seemed to pause when he entered a room, and subtle jokes that weren't quite jokes. He chose to ignore them, not wanting to make waves. Confrontation had never been necessary in this chapter of his life, and he had learned that patience often brought better results than immediate action. Still, the feeling of being watched, judged, or underestimated lingered. It was subtle, a quiet tension beneath the surface, like a storm on the horizon that everyone pretended didn't exist. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was warm, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and distant barbecues. He watched a group of children running down the street, their laughter mixing with the chirping of crickets. Everything seemed peaceful. It was the kind of evening that reminded him why he had stayed here, why he had chosen this neighborhood over so many others. The quiet comfort of life without chaos. But peace, he knew, was fragile. It could be shattered by a single act, a single decision made by someone who did not understand respect or humanity, and he had begun to notice a change in the neighborhood. There were new faces, people who didn't belong to the rhythm of the community. They moved with a certain arrogance, a sense of ownership over streets and homes that were not theirs. They spoke with casual disregard, laughed at things that were not funny, and seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort of others. His instincts, honed from years of intense training and life experiences, told him that this was not mere coincidence. Something was brewing. Despite these warnings, he continued his life as usual. He maintained his calm, smiled at neighbors, and kept his home orderly. Inside, however, he began to prepare mentally. His past had taught him that preparation was not about paranoia, it was about readiness. He organized his home carefully, made sure he knew every entrance and exit, and observed the patterns of people who seemed out of place. He did not want conflict, but he knew that when it arrived, it had to be met with intelligence and control, not panic. His work also offered a rhythm to his days, a sense of normalcy. He went to his job, interacted with coworkers, and did tasks diligently. No one at work had any reason to suspect the intensity of his past. To them, he was simply a man doing his job, reliable and professional. They did not know the countless hours of training, the missions he had undertaken, the discipline that ran through his veins. To them, he was ordinary. To him, the ordinary life was a treasure he protected fiercely, a fragile bubble he had fought to maintain after years of chaos and danger. Even in this calm, he found solace in small routines. He watered the plants in the morning, brewed his coffee just the way he liked it, and listened to music that reminded him of quieter times. He took long walks in the evening, observing the neighborhood, noting the shifts in behavior, the new faces, and the subtle changes that could signal trouble. To an outsider, these walks would seem normal, almost mundane. But to him, they were a form of vigilance, a silent preparation for whatever might come. At night, when the streetlights cast soft glows on the pavement and the neighborhood drifted into sleep, he often sat in his living room looking out the window, the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves. All of it was familiar, comforting yet underscored with caution. He remembered times in his life when quiet was deceptive, when danger could appear suddenly and without warning. Those memories were not regrets. They were lessons, reminders that calmness and awareness were not weaknesses but strengths. He rarely spoke about his past, and when he did, it was vague. He had learned that people often could not understand the depth of certain experiences. Words would not capture the intensity, the discipline, the fear, and the courage he had carried for years, so he let his past remain in the shadows, a private strength he drew from silently. It was a part of him that allowed him to live in peace without being naive, to smile without ignoring the realities around him, and to trust cautiously while being prepared for betrayal. Life seemed stable, almost idyllic. The neighborhood had a rhythm, the days passed predictably, and he found satisfaction in small routines. Yet, deep down, he knew that stability was never guaranteed. The peace he cherished could be broken by cruelty, ignorance, or hatred. And though he did not anticipate conflict, he remained ready for it. He knew that when darkness approached, calm and control would be his greatest allies. As part one closes, he sits in his living room, the sun long gone, the shadows stretching across the floor. Outside, the neighborhood sleeps, unaware of the storm quietly gathering beyond the edges of their peaceful streets. Inside, he sips his coffee, feeling the weight of awareness settle over him like a second skin. He is ordinary in the eyes of the world, but beneath the surface he is vigilant, disciplined, and prepared. The calm is real, but it is only the beginning. The quiet before the storm that will soon test everything he has built in this peaceful life. The calm of the neighborhood was shattered one night in a way no one could have expected. The man had gone to bed as usual, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the quiet house. He had just finished reading a book, the kind that offered escape and comfort, and had set it aside. The world outside seemed peaceful. The streetlights glowed faintly, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. But beneath this surface of normalcy, danger had already begun to move. It started with sounds that didn't belong, a crunching on gravel, a window sliding open with a harsh scrape, and voices that carried an edge of hostility. At first he stayed calm, listening carefully. Years of training and experience had taught him that panic was useless. Observation, control, and strategy were the weapons of the wise. The voices grew louder, harsh and cruel, mocking the neighborhood he had come to love. It wasn't a random disturbance. It was targeted. He slipped out of bed quietly, feeling the cool wood of the floor beneath his feet. He moved like a shadow, silent and deliberate, scanning the house with practiced precision. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every possible entry point was already familiar to him, and now he saw them not just as a home, but as a space to protect. The voices outside grew bolder, now laughing and shouting insults that made his jaw tighten. Their words were dripping with hatred, a venom aimed directly at him, designed to intimidate, to make him feel powerless. By the time he reached the living room, the intruders had begun to make their presence known in a more violent way. A window was smashed, glass scattering across the floor, glittering in the dim light like dangerous stars. Furniture shook as doors were rattled and kicked. The man took a deep breath. Every nerve in his body was alert, every sense heightened. Fear had no place. Here only clarity and control. He observed their movements carefully. They were not cautious, not clever. not aware of the fact that they were dealing with someone who had spent years anticipating danger in its most extreme forms. The gang was cruel and reckless. They tore through the house, throwing objects, breaking decorations, overturning chairs, and shattering the sense of peace that had taken years to build. They laughed as they destroyed, taking pleasure in the chaos. He watched silently, never making a sound, never revealing his presence. Every action they took gave him information, every misstep a clue to their weakness. In his mind, he cataloged their movements, memorized their numbers, and noted the tools they carried. This was not just vandalism. It was a test, a challenge, and it would be met with far more than force alone. As he moved through the house, he ensured that no one would accidentally get hurt in the chaos. He thought about neighbors who might be outside, people who might see and misunderstand the scene. Even in danger, he kept a sense of moral responsibility. The gang had no such concern. Their hate-filled energy seemed endless, a tide of cruelty meant to overwhelm, but he remained calm, calculating the steps he would take when the time came. He did not rush. He did not act out of anger. He let his discipline guide him. He could hear the gang talking among themselves, using words meant to provoke and intimidate. They underestimated him completely. In their eyes, he was just a man, an ordinary man, someone who could be pushed, threatened, and frightened. They had no idea of the life he had led, no inkling of the skills he had honed over years of grueling training, the resilience he had built through extreme situations. To them, he was a victim. But in truth, they had walked into the wrong house, into the wrong life, and they were about to learn that appearances could be deceiving. Despite the immediate danger, he thought clearly. He assessed the exits, noting how the gang moved through the rooms. He listened to their breathing, their footsteps, the way they coordinated or failed to coordinate with one another. Every detail mattered. Every sound was a signal. He knew exactly when and where he could intervene, when to move, when to remain unseen. His mind worked like a machine, analyzing risk, anticipating reactions, and preparing responses that would allow him to regain control without unnecessary violence. He could have confronted them immediately. He could have revealed his strength and ended the attack in seconds, but he did not. He wanted them to reveal themselves completely, to show every flaw, every weakness. Patience had always been more powerful than brute force. By letting them act recklessly, he gained the advantage. Their own hate and arrogance were tools he could use. He moved quietly, avoiding sight, keeping himself safe while allowing their foolishness to guide the outcome. As the gang moved to the kitchen, breaking cabinets and tossing utensils across the floor, he began to notice the pattern in their destruction. They were aggressive but chaotic, lacking coordination, relying on intimidation rather than skill. This told him everything he needed to know. They were dangerous in numbers, but individually, they were careless. He would exploit that. He could see the fear they tried to mask behind laughter. Deep down, even they knew they had walked into something far bigger than themselves. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sounds of their voices to other parts of the neighborhood. He knew neighbors might wake, might call the police, or even intervene. But the gang's presence was mostly unnoticed. People preferred to stay inside, to ignore what was happening. Fear and apathy often allowed hate to act unchecked. He observed this quietly, recognizing the failure of the community around him not with anger but as a reminder that the world was not always fair. Protection sometimes had to come from within. He slipped back to a safe corner of the house, watching the gang move through the rooms. The shattered glass, the overturned furniture, the torn curtains, they had left a mark, but the house itself, built sturdily and with care, had withstood much of their attack. He thought about the work ahead. Not just the cleanup, but the restoration of his sense of safety, the reclamation of his home and peace of mind. The gang had tried to strip him of control, to scare him into submission, but they did not yet understand the strength that lay beneath his calm exterior. Time passed in a blur. To the gang, it might have seemed like hours of chaotic fun, a night spent mocking and destroying. But to him, each minute was a lesson, a map, a guide to future action. He memorized the sound of their boots, the way they whispered to one another, and the moments when they hesitated or revealed fear. He knew that every action they took now would work against them later. They were predictable because they acted out of anger and hate, not strategy. And he was the opposite, controlled, disciplined, and ready. When the gang finally left, Slamming the door behind them, the house was a mess. Broken glass sparkled in the dim light, furniture was overturned, and walls bore the marks of vandalism. Threatening messages had been left behind, scrawled in cruel, mocking handwriting. He stood for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. There was anger, yes, but it was tempered by focus. He did not scream. He did not cry. He assessed, planned, and prepared. The next steps were clear. The chaos outside had revealed everything he needed to know, and now it was time to act, but on his terms. He cleaned the immediate danger first, ensuring no broken glass or sharp objects would cause injury. He carefully documented the damage, taking note of every detail, every clue left behind by the intruders. Evidence would be important, not only to protect himself legally, but to expose the truth of what had happened. He worked methodically, even as his mind replayed the intrusion in slow motion, analyzing every move, every misstep the gang had made. In this he found a strange sense of calm. Chaos outside the walls of his home could not touch the order he created within. As dawn approached, the neighborhood remained quiet, oblivious to the storm that had passed in the dead of night. He stood in the living room, surveying the aftermath, feeling a mixture of anger, sorrow, and determination. He knew that the attack was not random, not meaningless. It was a warning, a statement of hate, but it was also an opportunity. It had shown him the weaknesses of those who believed themselves strong through fear and numbers. He would remember everything, prepare for what was next, and ensure that his life, his home, and his peace were never threatened again. He sat down at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sunlight creep through the shattered curtains. The neighborhood was waking, children laughing in the distance, neighbors starting their routines, unaware of the events that had unfolded just hours before. To them, life was normal. To him, life had shifted. The world could no longer take his calm for granted. He had seen its darkness, and he was ready. Not with anger, not with rage, but with clarity, discipline, and the silent knowledge that he was far stronger than anyone could imagine. That night had ended, but it marked the beginning of something far larger. The gang had shown their cruelty, but in doing so, they had revealed themselves entirely. And he had seen it all, remembered it all, and was already planning what would come next. Their hatred had been a test, and they had failed. He would not let fear dominate his life. The world outside could be cruel, but inside his house, inside his mind, he remained unbroken, disciplined, and in control. The morning after the attack, the house felt different. The sunlight streamed through the broken windows, casting sharp patterns across the floor. Dust and splinters hung in the air, and the faint smell of smoke from where a candle had been knocked over lingered. Everything in the house seemed to whisper reminders of the previous night, the violence, the fear, the invasion of safety. Yet the man did not feel defeated. He felt focused. He had survived, observed, and now it was time to reflect. As he moved through the rooms, picking up shards of glass and setting furniture back in place, memories he had long buried began to resurface. For years he had kept his past locked away, hidden behind polite smiles and small talk. Few people knew the truth. To most, he was simply a quiet man, living a simple life. But beneath the surface, he carried a history that was anything but ordinary. He had once been a Navy SEAL, trained to face danger in its most extreme forms, to survive situations most people couldn't even imagine, and to emerge not only alive but victorious. He paused in the kitchen, holding a piece of broken ceramic in his hand. His mind drifted back to his days in the military. The intense physical training, the long hours of strategy sessions, the missions that took him across the globe, the nights spent in the darkness waiting for the right moment to act. All of it flashed in his memory. He remembered the discipline, the patience, and the focus that had been drilled into him. Every action had a purpose, every movement was calculated, and hesitation could mean failure or death. That life was behind him, yes, but the skills, the strength, and the mindset had never left. He thought about the gang that had invaded his home. They had been reckless, arrogant, and cruel, believing that fear and numbers were enough to overpower him. They had underestimated not just his physical abilities, but his mind. Every moment they had spent breaking his home had been a mistake. In their arrogance, they had revealed patterns, weaknesses, and flaws that only someone trained to observe and respond could see. And he had seen them all. Sitting down at the kitchen table, he began to plan, not with anger, not with blind retaliation, but with clarity and precision. He knew that any response had to be smart, deliberate, and effective. The goal was not to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but to ensure that those responsible could no longer threaten him or anyone else. Every step had to be measured. Every move had to be strategic. Years of training had taught him that patience often yielded far better results than immediate action. As he worked, he thought about the people around him. Some neighbors would wake, notice the broken windows and scattered furniture, and maybe whisper among themselves. Some might assume it was random vandalism, others might think it was personal, and a few might even suspect him somehow, but the truth was more complex. He had lived through situations where appearances were deceiving. People judged too quickly, assumed too easily, and overlooked the deeper reality. He had learned to act in ways that revealed truth, not just to himself, but in ways that could expose deception and cruelty to the world. He began to gather evidence. Photographs of the damage, notes about what had been taken or destroyed, the messages left behind, they were all important. He knew that documentation could serve as both protection and leverage. The gang had left traces of themselves, small mistakes that revealed their identity and habits. These mistakes, if understood correctly, could be used to anticipate future actions or even to alert authorities. Planning, observation, and knowledge had always been more powerful than brute force, and now they would guide him once again. As the hours passed, he also prepared mentally. The calm exterior he maintained in daily life was not a mask of weakness, it was strength. It allowed him to observe, think, and act without being controlled by fear or anger. He reviewed scenarios in his mind, visualized the gang's possible reactions, and rehearsed responses that were both effective and measured. This was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming his home, his safety, and his peace of mind. He understood the danger, but he also understood the power of preparation and strategy. The more he thought about the intrusion, the clearer it became. The gang had acted out of hate, but their hate had been poorly organized. They had not planned for resistance, had not anticipated strategy, and had assumed that intimidation alone would work. In their arrogance, they had underestimated one thing: him. The man who appeared ordinary, who smiled and nodded politely in casual conversation, was not just resilient, he was trained to respond in ways that would turn the tables completely. They had revealed themselves in ways he could use to his advantage. By late afternoon, he had completed an initial assessment of the house. Repairs would be needed, but those could wait until he addressed the deeper problem. He moved through the rooms again, imagining every possible scenario. Every entrance, every exit, every window and door became part of a mental map. He thought about the gang's likely behavior patterns, their weaknesses, and how he could ensure that they would never threaten him again. His mind worked as it had in missions long ago, combining observation, anticipation, and strategy. While planning, he reflected on what this situation meant for his life now. He had worked hard to build a sense of normalcy, to leave behind the chaos and danger of his past, yet the world had a way of intruding, of testing the boundaries of peace. He realized that he could no longer live in complete ignorance of the dangers around him. Awareness, preparation, and readiness were necessary. But these things did not define him. They simply supported the life he valued. Calmness, intelligence, and discipline were his tools for navigating this sudden storm. In the evening, he walked outside briefly, observing the street, the neighbors, and the environment around his home. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, unaware of the violence that had occurred hours before. He noted the positions of streetlights, the locations where shadows could hide, and potential paths of approach or escape. To an ordinary observer, he looked like a man taking a stroll, perhaps reflecting on the day or enjoying the cool air. But his eyes saw patterns, behavior, and opportunity. He understood that safety and control were not given. They were earned through vigilance and knowledge. Returning inside, he sat again at the table and thought about his own response. Violence could be tempting, especially after the invasion of his home and the clear disrespect shown by the gang. But he knew that reaction without thought could be dangerous. He remembered the discipline drilled into him during his Navy SEAL training. Every move must have purpose, every action calculated. He did not need to act immediately. The gang's own carelessness had given him the advantage. Patience, observation, and strategic action would allow him to regain control fully and decisively. As night fell, the quiet returned, though now it felt charged with tension. The broken windows, the overturned furniture, and the hateful messages reminded him that the neighborhood's calm could be deceptive. Safety was not guaranteed, but awareness and preparation provided power. He reviewed everything again in his mind. The gang's likely behavior, his plan for the house, potential strategies for reclaiming control, and ways to ensure that this violation would not repeat. Every detail mattered. Every mistake they had made could be leveraged. He also reflected on the lessons this experience offered. Life could be cruel, and people could be blind to morality or justice, but individuals had power when they combined intelligence, discipline, and courage. He had lived through extreme danger before and had survived through careful observation and strategic action. That past had prepared him for this moment, even if the situation seemed small compared to what he had faced before. He understood that power was not always measured by physical strength alone. Sometimes it was measured by patience, foresight, and the ability to act decisively when the time came. Throughout the night, he maintained a quiet vigilance. He listened to the sounds of the neighborhood, noting any unusual noises, movements, or activity. His mind replayed the previous night, analyzing every detail, considering the gang's motives, their weaknesses, and how they might act in the future. This mental rehearsal was not obsession. It was preparation, a way to reclaim control over the chaos that had entered his life. He knew that the first step in regaining peace was understanding fully the threat he faced. By the time morning came again, he had completed a detailed plan in his mind. The intruders had revealed everything he needed to know, their arrogance, carelessness, and patterns of behavior. He was ready to act, not recklessly but intelligently. The knowledge of his own capabilities, honed over years of intense training, gave him confidence. He knew that when the time came, he could protect himself, reclaim his home, and ensure that the gang could never threaten him again. The calm and order he valued so deeply would be restored, and this time it would be stronger than ever. As part 3 ends, he sits quietly at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, the house still showing the scars of the attack but holding steady. He reflects on the power of patience, the value of discipline, and the strength that comes from preparation. The chaos of the previous night has been turned into a source of clarity. He is no longer just a man recovering from an attack. He is a strategist, a protector, and someone ready to reclaim control of his life. The past has returned to guide the present, and the next steps he takes will be decisive, measured, and powerful. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, as he moved through his home with deliberate calm. The events of the past few days had sharpened him, and now every sound, every shadow, every movement outside the house was observed with precision. He had spent hours studying the gang's behavior, noting their arrogance, their carelessness, and the patterns they had left behind. Tonight, it was no longer just about recovery. It was about taking control. He started with small, careful preparations. He rearranged the interior so that any approach by an intruder could be anticipated. Furniture was positioned strategically, allowing clear lines of sight and paths for movement. He cleared areas of clutter so nothing could be used against him or trip him in an emergency. Every adjustment, no matter how minor, was deliberate. Years of training had taught him that small details often made the difference between control and chaos. Next, he focused on observation. He set up simple surveillance around the house using cameras he already owned, ensuring he could monitor entrances and exits without being seen. He tested each angle, checking for blind spots, and made mental notes about what to watch for. His eyes traced the shadows outside, listening for footsteps, the rustle of leaves, and the faintest noises that indicated movement. Awareness had always been a weapon in his hands, and tonight it was sharper than ever. As he worked, he thought about the psychology of the gang. They were reckless and arrogant, believing strength lay in intimidation and fear. They assumed he was just an ordinary man, unaware of their miscalculations. That assumption was their weakness. He knew that people who relied solely on brute force rarely anticipated strategy, patience, or intelligence. They were predictable because they acted on impulse, not observation. He smiled faintly to himself, knowing that their own mistakes would soon guide him. He prepared traps, not in the violent sense, but as careful measures to alert him and slow anyone who might attempt to return. Simple things, a few objects that would make noise if moved, subtle changes in furniture alignment, and paths that allowed him to anticipate steps before they were taken. He didn't need to strike immediately. He only needed to control the environment. Every advantage counted, Night deepened, and the house seemed to breathe with him. The shadows were longer, the sounds quieter, and the air held a tension that made every sense sharper. He reviewed in his mind what he knew about the gang, their likely numbers, how they had acted during the first attack, and the mistakes they had made. He imagined scenarios, each one more detailed than the last, mentally practicing how he would respond if they came back. With each rehearsal, he grew more confident, more certain, more prepared. He also considered his own emotions. Anger was natural, but uncontrolled anger was dangerous. Hatred could blind him and fear could paralyze. But he did not allow these feelings to control him. Instead, he focused them into awareness, strategy, and precision. His past had taught him that control over oneself was the first step to control over the environment. He was not only protecting his home, he was practicing mastery over the chaos that others had tried to impose. Hours passed quietly, and then the subtle signs began. The distant sound of a car, too slow and too deliberate, approached the street. He remained still, observing through the window. Two figures emerged from the shadows, moving with caution, but still unaware that the house was now under surveillance. They carried tools, their movements sloppy yet purposeful, clearly intending to finish what they had started. But this time they were no longer in control. He observed them carefully, noting every detail, the way they moved, the rhythm of their steps, the careless manner in which they checked the locks, and the confidence that had never truly belonged to them. Their arrogance had not diminished, even after their first failure. That overconfidence, he knew, was their downfall. With each step, they revealed more about themselves, their weaknesses, their predictable reactions, their reliance on fear over intelligence. He began to move, silently, deliberately. Each step was measured, each movement controlled. He did not rush. He did not react with panic or anger. Instead, he allowed their behavior to guide him, ensuring that when the moment came, his actions would be decisive and effective. The night had shifted. The advantage which had belonged to the intruders before now lay with him. From his hidden vantage points, he observed as one of them approached the back door, attempting to force it open. A small, carefully placed object made a noise underfoot, startling the intruder. He froze, glancing around, unaware of the man watching from inside. The other gang member moved to investigate, their coordination poor, their instincts flawed. They assumed they could intimidate, but intimidation alone could not overcome preparation, discipline, and intelligence. He allowed the moment to unfold fully. The intruders were distracted, confused, and increasingly nervous. He had not struck yet, and that hesitation worked in his favor. Their own fear began to erode their confidence while he remained calm, patient, and ready. His knowledge of their likely reactions allowed him to anticipate each movement before it happened. In that quiet, tense space, he held complete control, not through aggression, but through awareness, strategy, and timing. Using the layout of his home to his advantage, he moved silently to a position where he could intercept if necessary. Every shadow, every doorway, every angle had been planned in advance. He imagined scenarios where they could retreat, where they could attempt to flee, and where he could guide the outcome. Violence was not his goal. Restoration of control was. Yet if force became necessary, he was prepared to use it decisively, efficiently, and without hesitation. The gang began to fumble, their lack of coordination evident. One of them knocked over an object, producing a loud sound that made them flinch. They glanced around nervously, realizing that the house no longer belonged to them. Their fear was growing, and it was clear that they did not understand the depth of the man's skills. He could almost smile at the irony. They had come to terrorize, but they were the ones who were now vulnerable. He began to take measured actions. Using a combination of distraction and careful placement, he ensured they could not move freely. Objects shifted subtly underfoot. Paths blocked quietly, and his presence, unseen, guided them toward predictable reactions. Every movement they made confirmed what he had observed and anticipated. They were acting on impulse while he acted with precision. They had underestimated him completely, and that miscalculation was now their greatest weakness. Time seemed to stretch, the night air thick with tension. Every sound was amplified. The rustle of leaves, the scraping of shoes, the faint whisper of conversation between the intruders. He listened, analyzed, and anticipated. Each step they took reinforced the plan he had formed, allowing him to control the outcome before it even began. He had turned what could have been chaos into a calculated scenario, one in which he held all the power. When they attempted to regroup and coordinate, he revealed himself not with rage but with quiet authority. His presence, calm and disciplined, startled them. They had expected an ordinary man, someone intimidated by their aggression. They were wrong. The fear in their eyes was immediate, a reflection of their own poor preparation and overconfidence. He spoke calmly, clearly and without threat, but with a presence that left no room for misjudgment. They understood in that moment that the situation was no longer under their control. The intruders froze, unsure how to react. Every path they could take had been anticipated. Every movement they might make had been accounted for. He did not need to escalate to violence. The control was psychological as much as physical. They had been reckless, arrogant, and cruel, and now they faced someone who combined calm intelligence with lethal skill. Their fear was a mirror of his awareness, and it worked in his favor. By the time the night ended, the gang had retreated, humiliated, and disoriented. Their plan to intimidate, destroy, and terrorize had failed completely. He had regained control of his home, restored safety without unnecessary violence, and demonstrated the power of patience, observation, and strategy. The damage to the house could be repaired, but the lesson was far deeper. He had taken what could have been fear and chaos and turned it into mastery and control. As he sat back in the quiet of his home, he reflected on the events of the night. The calm, disciplined approach had worked. His past as a Navy SEAL had been more than preparation. It had been a guide, a tool, and a source of strength. Violence was not always the answer. Intelligence, awareness, and timing were equally powerful. He had protected what mattered most: his home, his safety, and his peace of mind. The night had ended, but the confidence it brought would remain. He understood that threats could arise at any time, but he also knew that he possessed the skills to face them. His past had returned, not as a burden but as a source of power, and now, with control regained, he could rebuild, restore, and live with a sense of safety and clarity that only came from true preparedness. The sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, painting the streets with a soft golden light. The quiet calm of the morning seemed ordinary to anyone passing by. But inside the house, the man felt a sense of triumph mixed with careful reflection. The chaos of the previous nights had tested him in ways most people could not imagine. Yet he had emerged not only unbroken but stronger, calmer, and more in control than ever. He began the day by surveying the house once more. The broken windows, overturned furniture, and shattered glass remained as reminders, but they no longer represented defeat. They were evidence of survival, of resilience, and of the lessons learned from careful observation and strategy. He moved slowly, picking up debris, restoring order where he could, and mentally noting improvements that would prevent future intrusions. The house was not only a shelter, but a symbol of the life he had fought to protect. While cleaning and organizing, he also thought about the gang. They had entered his home with arrogance and hate, believing themselves powerful because of numbers and intimidation. But they had miscalculated. They had underestimated him, failed to recognize the discipline, intelligence, and skill that lay beneath his quiet demeanor. Their recklessness had left them vulnerable, and now the consequences of their actions would unfold, not through anger, but through measured justice. He contacted the authorities, providing every detail he had recorded: photographs of the damage, evidence of forced entry, and careful notes about the intruders' behavior and potential identities. He knew that justice could not rely solely on personal skill. It required the proper channels, the law, and careful documentation. His previous experiences had taught him that even the strongest person cannot enforce order alone. Strategy extended beyond immediate action. It included planning for consequences and ensuring accountability. As the investigation began, he continued to secure his home. Locks were reinforced, new security measures were installed, and